generosity to stay in business. Oh, and I'm just getting a reminder that tonight's event is being recorded. So, let's keep it family friendly. It's a joke. Tonight's topic is about Walt Disney and the Disney Company, just in time for Walt Disney World's 50th anniversary. That's on October 1st, for those of you who keep track of such things. And I just want to say a couple words in advance of our speaker here. When it comes to Disney, the company is notoriously secretive. I believe Jennifer called it a slash and burn style of corporate behavior. They don't like to have their activities and their history cataloged by anyone other than themselves. They like to produce narratives that they can control. And so it has been traditionally very difficult for professional scholars to crack that nut and to uncover the real history of the Disney Company and its parks and its products. But that does not stop a legion of Disney fans from doing their best to follow the Disney Company's changes and to catalog things in real time. The internet has done wonders for our ability to dig up video and pictures and record that history in real time. So keep that in mind, because Jennifer Begakis is very unique in that aspect, in that she is one of the few professional scholars who is actually pursuing Disney as a research topic rather than as kind of a casual, fun hobby, as I have done myself and as have many others. We just don't have the will to go head to head with the mouse to get some of their real history uncovered. But Jennifer is working on that right now. So I hope that you keep that in perspective. What she's doing is truly unique and worth our attention. As far as you go, I'd ask that you hold your questions until the end and comments. At that point, when she's wrapped up, we can open up the floor to whatever is on your mind. You've got a hand raised option there under reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you're new to Zoom, just look down there at the bottom of the screen. You should have all kinds of options. One of them says reactions. Just hit that button. Raise hand should be there, as well as other emotions. So if you end up crying at some point, you can, or that's a laughing with tears. So feel free to laugh with tears or art or whatever suits your interest. We'll come to that at the end, and we are very eager to hear what you have to say. It doesn't have to be a question. It can just be an experience you've had or some insight. This research is in progress right now. So anything that you have that might help her is welcome. Any kind of feedback. I can tell you as a professional historian, this is what we live for, opportunities to engage the public and show what we're working on and then get the feedback. It's very helpful. For those of you who are not in academics, don't see your question or comment as a challenge in any way. We welcome it. We want to know what you're thinking. It helps us better understand what we're working on and how to shape our argument. So with no further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Jennifer Begakis is a PhD candidate at Cornell University, which is just down the road from us, so almost next door. She studies the history of capitalism, consumerism, business culture, primarily in the 20th century. She's currently teaching a course on Walt Disney's ABC series, Walt Disney Presents. And some of you may be old enough to remember this series. Very big deal, led up to the opening of his theme parks and really kind of primed the pump on the public's interest in his products and his films and his parks. Very smart move. I'm sure she'll be talking about that tonight. That's a class I would love to take. Sadly, I think I've missed the bus on it, but perhaps another time she'll teach it. Her dissertation, which fingers crossed will become a book that we can all get, is called The Best Laid Plans of Mouse and Man, Testing the Limits of Disney's Strategic Planning. And hopefully that'll be on the shelves in the next couple of years, and we can all get a copy and remember when we had the opportunity to meet her and hear her work in progress. So without further ado, Jennifer, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction and for this opportunity to present my research. I'm very excited about it. It's very timely with the anniversary of Walt Disney World. Yes. And I've been thinking a lot about how, the anniversary and all of the contemporary news media that's been covering Walt Disney World and Walt's legacy. And it really sparked my particular point of entry into what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So, the title of this is Walt and Wall Street. And what I will be highlighting is the story of the first and only Disney park and resort that Walt Disney opened in his lifetime, and the strategies with which he did that, that built a cornerstone of this famous entertainment company's business, which is the Disney Parks and Resorts. So I'm going to share my screen with a slide because I like to do this, and I like to do this when I teach too. I like to open up with a question. Let's see. Okay, so if you can see the screen, I have this question of who built the Disney parks and resorts, Walt or Wall Street? And what I like about this is that it's deceptively simple, right? So if you ask someone who built the Disney parks and resorts, more often than not, they'd point to the first park that started it all. So Disneyland opens in 1955, and that is the park that comes before Walt Disney World, which opens in the 1970s, and then you have all of the international expansion thereafter. But what I want to show is that this question of who built the park, Walt or Wall Street, actually shows that Walt Disney's legacy is perhaps more important to the current state of parks and resorts than we often think it is. So I'm going to jump back in time to the 1940s. So this right here, this slide that I have, this is the first stock certificate that is issued by Walt Disney Productions that goes public in 1940 to Walt Disney himself. So the company goes public in 1940, which is 2 years after they premiere Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which is the first full-length feature animated film. The film is a tremendous success, it both in terms of its revenue, as well as really elevating the Disney name to a high status in Hollywood amongst much larger studios. So 2 years after the film premieres, Walt Disney Productions goes public in 1940. So from there, the company is able to use the revenue from Snow White to expand the animation and film studio. And they do so, they move the studio into Burbank, and they begin a lot more ambitious projects. However, I am a historian of the 20th century. We all know the turmoil that happens in the 1940s. So much of the projects are shelved, put on hold, and altogether frozen in the early 1940s because of World War II. So Walt Disney Productions shifts business to government-sponsored contracts. Walt Disney Productions will go on to produce a series of propaganda cartoons and films for the US military. And that income keeps the company afloat. However, the frozen projects, along with the newly public company, creates this sort of tension of where does the company go next? Because the greatest hit that launched them into going public in 1940, that was 1938. So the war ends, 1945, and the state of the post-war market is quite uncertain. And shareholders of this public company, Walt Disney Productions, are not eager to throw money into new animation, new technologies that Walt is very famous for. Snow White is a great example, but going all the way back to Mickey Mouse and the invention of sync sound technology. So the company is quite conservative in this post-war market. So that's what I'm going to focus on is, all right, the war is over, 1946. In the decade between the end of the war and the opening of Disneyland, 1955, events that occurred at the company and between Walt Disney and shareholders of the company directly affected the existing organizational structure of Walt Disney Productions and allowed Walt Disney to build Disneyland. So, all right, so this, it seems not that exciting, but it's going to get exciting. This part right now that I'm talking about is coming from a chapter of my dissertation, which is about divesting in Walt Disney. Now, that can sound kind of jargony, but what I really like about this chapter in particular is that when I started working on it, it was around the time that a company we all know and have opinions about, like we all know and have opinions about Disney, Tesla, was in the process of doing a similar thing with its founder. The shareholders of Tesla decided to push out Elon Musk of the company due to some erratic behavior and some of his presence on Twitter. So funny enough, I was writing this part of this chapter around when that happened, and I could see a lot of the parallels. So going back to 1946, it's not the Tesla Elon Musk debacle. The company, as I mentioned, wasn't inclined to let Walt Disney pursue some of his more ambitious plans. Roy Disney, the CEO of Walt Disney Productions, Walt Disney's brother, he had always been more conservative when it came to expenditures, the animation and film studio, and in general, the company's expenses. However, after the war, Walt Disney began to chafe against the new post-war fiscal constraints. In wartime, it seemed fitting, appropriate, understandable. In the post-war period, it was rather frustrating to Walt Disney. So in 1946, Walt Disney stopped attending company board meetings. And 1 year later, in 1947, his standing salary contract with Walt Disney Productions expired. Though Walt Disney remained the name, the face, and the hallmark feature of Walt Disney Productions, he grew further removed from the day-to-day company business. As I mentioned, frustrated with the post-war constraints and executive oversight, he began to lose enthusiasm for several projects that faced budget constraints and cuts. And this continued to the end of the decade. So by the end of the 1940s, Disney had stepped down as the head of the animation studio. Meanwhile, he begins to focus more of his attention on his hobbies, his pet projects, a lot of those projects outside of the studio and in his own home. So in 1947, he purchases an electric model train as a birthday and Christmas gift to himself. And this is one of his newest hobbies to sort of distract himself from the issues of the studio. He also started to pursue independent business ventures. And I deal with this in an earlier chapter of my dissertation of Walt Disney's first attempt at an investment in the tourism or recreation market that is in Pasadena, California, that doesn't come to pass. But that being said, it's one example of a collection of attempts that he has to pursue business outside of Walt Disney Productions. So he spends the latter half of the 1940s looking for these investment opportunities, looking to turn some of his hobbies into money-making endeavors on his own. And because of his lack of involvement at the studio, there's very little oversight when it comes to these pursuits. And without signing a new salary contract, company executives had little recourse at that time to rein in some of his ambitions. However, for shareholders and executives at Walt Disney Productions in the post-war period, particularly as they hit the end of the 1940s, one of the first orders of business in this uncertain market was protecting the public company from financial loss, yes, extra risk, and particularly those incurred by one of Walt Disney's new pursuits. So beyond mere hobbies like the train, Disney's new investment schemes might actually extend to a misuse of the company's funds. This being the case, in 1951, Roy Disney pitched to the Walt Disney Productions Board of Directors a ownership realignment plan between the company and Walt Disney. So Roy requested that the shareholders vote on whether his brother's use of his name and likeness should be considered part of the company's core competency and therefore should be owned by the firm. So again, Roy Disney pitches this idea to the shareholders for them to decide if Walt Disney is to pursue business and use his name and his face to do so, should that be considered part of the company's business? Between 1951 and 1953, the board negotiates this question and they discuss it, and it's not unanimous, but eventually they negotiate a divestment deal with the company's founder. They held off approval of the deal for a little over a year, but eventually the men of the board voted in favor of Roy Disney's realignment plan. So it's really important for me to underscore that this decision to change the public company's stake in its founder was entirely new for the company. This divestment was not necessarily something the board would have approved in past years. But while taking Walt Disney's apparent disinterest in the company's business, the board questioned still how Walt Disney Productions might continue to run the business without owning the rights to the firm's name. Walt Disney was the firm's famous figurehead. And some stockholders were nervous about what Roy was proposing. So in 1952, the company shareholders agreed to cede the rights of Walt Disney's name and likeness to Disney. They would retain a 40-year proprietary license to protect their competitive stake, but they legally separated themselves from Walt Disney because he appeared to be conducting business outside of the company's current goals, using his name and his likeness. So this divestment in Walt was thus a way of creating space between the public company and Walt Disney, its founder, his seemingly reckless independent ventures. And the terms of the divestment in Walt Disney accomplished precisely that. The result was, as I mentioned, stockholders agreeing to cede the rights of Disney's name and likeness, while they would pay Disney royalties to license the use of his name and likeness. This realignment was an essential safeguard in this post-war market for the company's shareholders and executives. When the divestment vote passed, the company chose legal separation in the name of security. So in other words, rather than force Disney to sign a new company salary and pay him a company salary for his side projects that would continue to fund his side projects, the deal restricted Walt Disney's use of Walt Disney Productions funds by realigning the firm's ownership stake in Walt Disney. So by transferring ownership of his name and likeness to Disney, Walt Disney Productions minimized the company's legal and financial burden and liabilities associated with Disney's hobbies and his outside projects. So this deal which, it's negotiated in the early 1950s, it eventually passes in 1952. What it illustrates is an acknowledgement that Disney's independent ventures were more than just hobbies. In fact, they were exposing this public company to a level of risk that they were not comfortable taking. And yes, it is clear that Disney had outgrown his role at the animation studio, and he was having a hard time working under the current constraints in this post-war market. That being said, Disney and the name Walt Disney, the face Walt Disney, was the firm's greatest asset. It was one of its most recognizable features and most distinct qualities. However, these side projects and independent ventures, hobbies, may have made Walt Disney their biggest liability. So I like to demystify jargon. It's one of my favorite things, particularly when I teach. And when I say divestiture or divestment, it's sort of a boring word, but I like to think about it as a divorce. So divestment in the company's founder was as though Walt Disney Productions and Walt Disney were agreeing to file for a divorce. And much like a messy divorce, the opinions on legal separation were mixed. So several members of the board rejected outright Roy's plan to divest in Disney. In fact, the final terms of the divestiture would later have one former member of the board suing Walt Disney Productions, fellow board members, both past and present, a little after a year the realignment plan was finalized. So this brings me to my slide here, and I'm going to explain this minority shareholders, all of the grievances that went into this. So a minority shareholder accused the men listed in the suit in 1953 of first refusing to pay dividends dating back to 1947. The legal counsel for the Walt Disney Productions stockholder, the complainant, cited the terms of Walt Disney's new contract following the divestment, including new generous royalty payments as context for the lawsuit. So speaking to a judge at the Los Angeles Superior Court, a representative of the owner of 500 shares of stock in Walt Disney Productions described the terms of the divestment deal and compensation agreement as, quote, unreasonable, excessive, and out of proportion in view of the corporation's net earnings. The plaintiff requested that the judge declare the divestment deal with Walt Disney invalid. He also demanded that all compensation from the public company to Walt Disney be investigated since 1940, and that any, quote, excessive payments be returned to Walt Disney Productions stockholders. So this is from Los Angeles Times report of the trial. But to sort of get to beyond some of the complaints about the past dividends, because past and present dividends, that was one of several charges against Walt Disney and Walt Disney Productions. But the reason why this is important is because the value of company stock, so of this minority shareholder stock, was particularly unsettled right after the divestment deal. Because following divestment, Walt Disney incorporates a separate company, independent of Walt Disney Productions, with his name and his likeness. So soon after the 1952 divestment deal, Walt Disney formed a new company, Walt Disney Incorporated, or WDI, with the rights to his name and likeness. So Disney is able to do this because he's now legally independent from the firm. And he's also receiving royalty payments from the firm. The ongoing royalty payments provided Walt Disney's new company seed money, both to incorporate and for him to hire a small staff. The 40-year licensing agreement for his royalty payments locked in the company, Walt Disney Productions' financial stake in Walt Disney. But divestment gave him the freedom to conduct his own business. So now, in 1952, he's able to leverage the value of his name and his likeness, which is a feature that would later be critical to his next move in building Disneyland. But 1 year after Walt Disney Incorporated is incorporated, Roy Disney, following this lawsuit, advises his brother to rebrand the company. So in 1953, Disney Incorporated, WDI, Walt Disney Incorporated, reincorporates as WED Enterprises, which houses the first Disney Imagineers. They are nicknamed later that year. So this startup company, Walt Disney Startup Company, housed a small engineering division and worked closely with him. And while Disney was eager to try his hand again at pursuing these hobbies, these independent creative ventures outside of Walt Disney Productions, he took the royalty payments that were now going to WED Enterprises, and he added to his already extensive personal collection of model trains and miniatures and small scale studio sets that featured several famous animated characters. So why divestment is so important in this moment is that this ownership realignment afforded Walt Disney newfound control over his name, his likeness, and his pet projects. And because his startup company was autonomous, was legally autonomous from Walt Disney Productions, now so was Walt Disney. The divestment may have been Walt's greatest victory, but I argue that without divestment, there is no Disneyland. So let's get into Disneyland. Okay, so this I have right here. What I really like, I actually assigned both of these documents to my students, and they got a kick out of it. So I have right here Disney on Television, and this next to it is the first guidebook that was produced before the park opened. So by 1954, the plans for Disneyland were well underway. Having decided on the Anaheim location in Orange County, California, the 160-acre theme park was expected to run $9 million, which included purchasing the land, as well as constructing the Imagineers park designs. And in the summer of 1954, Walt Disney met with the Orange County League of Cities to tour the grounds. He explained to the city and county officials that he had drafted several different versions of the park's plan. And he was eager to start building what journalists around Los Angeles and in Orange County had been casually referring to as the, quote, Fairyland project. And Walt Disney made it a habit to periodically check in with local city and county representatives about what they could expect and anticipate at his theme park. He was known to host dinner parties at the Anaheim Elks Club, where he would entertain guests by telling them exciting stories about how he had come to his creative ideas for Disneyland. And unveiling the creativity and the concepts for his park was one of Walt Disney's strategies to keep the public interested while he and his team behind the scenes crunched the numbers and figured out how to fund the construction of the park. So in that same summer, speaking to a reporter of the Los Angeles Times, Walt Disney confidently said that the park will be finished July 1955. And this episode's really funny to me because the journalist looked over apparently a stack of sketches that Walt brought with him to the interview, including various Imagineers designs. And the journalist responded to Walt Disney, "You'll never make it. July was less than a year away and construction was far from finished." Walt responded to the Times writer, "You want to bet on that?" Practical concerns aside, Walt Disney had managed to pull off amazing feats in the past. As I mentioned, he and his partner in animation at the time, Ub Iwerks, invented new sync sound technology for the first Mickey Mouse cartoons. So the journalist concedes to Walt no and says, I wouldn't even bet that Walt couldn't fly without wings. But all betting aside, it was soon clear to Walt Disney that his startup company, WED Imagineering, could not remain the sole financial backer of his project. Estimates for the park construction were now well over 10 million in the fall of 1955, or 1954 rather. And it was clear that the Disneyland project needed to attract outside investment to make these Imagineering designs into a theme park reality. So not only was the budget an issue, but the ideas kept coming. More and more ideas and exciting concepts for different attractions and lands. All of that meant that not only did WED Enterprises and Walt Disney need a larger budget, they also needed a flexible budget. So at this point, Walt approached his brother Roy. And Roy, who, as I had mentioned earlier, has always been more conservative when it comes to business expenses and company expenses. However, this project, the high price tag, didn't scare away the otherwise very prudent CEO of Walt Disney Productions. Because Walt had aligned himself in this moment when he was drafting his plans for Disneyland with the Stanford Research Institute, the figures and the numbers had an air of legitimacy to them that Roy could get behind. That being said, Roy Disney was not going to turn to the Walt Disney Productions Board of Directors to substantially invest in Disney's theme park, because that was what the divestment was to protect. But Roy was concerned about his brother's financial predicament following the 1952 divestment deal. And even before the plans for Disneyland got well underway, Roy was concerned. His brother had no ownership in Walt Disney Productions other than his initial stockholding. So he was worried about Walt, and he was worried as well that Walt was already publicizing this park without a conceivable plan of how to fund the park. So Roy Disney was on board, but Walt Disney Productions was not an option. So the brothers looked for different ways to raise capital for the construction of Disneyland. First, Roy recommended his brother incorporate the theme park into a separate company, so separate from Walt Disney's startup company, Wed Enterprises. So the park is incorporated into Disneyland Incorporated. The next suggestion was to look to leverage the public's already growing excitement for Walt Disney's theme park to secure the necessary capital and outside investments for construction. So Roy travels to New York City and he pitches Walt Disney's ideas and the Imagineers' sketches of the theme park to national television networks. And so ABC bites. The American Broadcast Company agrees to a $500,000 investment deal with Walt Disney into Disneyland Incorporated, guarantees an additional $4 million in loans for park construction. In exchange, the contract gave ABC exclusive rights to operate food concessions within the park. And Walt Disney signed with ABC to produce a weekly telecast, initially titled Walt Disney's Disneyland. And it will be renamed Walt Disney Presents in 1958. And this show starring Walt Disney himself. So for ABC, this was an ace in a hole for them to compete with the other large television networks. This was a groundbreaking move to television by a Hollywood producer. It's well documented in the Los Angeles Times and even sort of poo-pooed and criticized by some of the other big names in Hollywood. This is the first time a Hollywood head of studio signs a deal to produce and star in a telecast. Aside from that, the weekly television show was a tremendous asset for Walt Disney, who was in the middle of building Disneyland. His show, which began in the fall of 1954, brought in enough cash to move forward and break ground with construction. And so when the deal with ABC is announced to the press, Walt Disney says, we'll have a variety show. This is much more than that. Not only had Walt secured a TV audience to debut park designs to future guests, the television show was a reoccurring sales pitch to potential investors in the park. So to put it another way, Walt Disney just signed a deal with ABC to produce an hour-long weekly primetime commercial for an unbuilt Disneyland. So as I mentioned, the deal was critical as far as affording the cash to break grounds with Disneyland. That being said, the capital that ABC invested could not cover the financial burden of construction. In fact, all right, so we have right here some construction, lovely construction photos. The lack of sufficient funding appeared to be the biggest obstacle facing Disneyland. Uh-oh, I don't want that. My apologies. My Microsoft is trying to reboot. Yeah, so the lack of sufficient funding appeared to be the single largest obstacle facing Disneyland. But Walt felt that with a reputable investor like ABC, he would begin to attract other investors, other reputable investors. And that sort of, he would use the television show and he could show his credibility, and that would sort of raise his esteem, and particularly with an eye towards the East Coast and thinking about not just television networks, but other companies that had invested in ABC. But Roy Disney was not as confident. So at the time, Roy Disney turned to one member of the Stanford Research Institute who was a director of the project to build the master plan for Disneyland. And he's a man named Stevie Wood, and a very colorful character. So Roy looked to Stevie Wood to come up with another creative financial solution to get out of this financing predicament. Roy offered Wood the chance to leave the Stanford Research Institute and join Walt Disney's project as the new vice president of Disneyland Incorporated and general manager of the theme park. Because at this time, Roy did believe that Walt Disney may be able to pull this thing off, but a master plan for the park was still not enough to turn the concepts into a working theme park. So Roy met with C.V. Wood and he offered him the job of building Disneyland. And this episode of Roy's private meeting with Wood is really fascinating. And so it's unclear why Roy Disney would exclude Walt from negotiations with C.V. Wood. And I'm gonna reference a Disney historian, Todd James Pierce, who wrote a fantastic book about C.V. Wood, who is one of the most difficult individuals that has ever worked for Disney to research. In fact, the archives, apparently his collection of papers, C.V. Wood, they still exist in legal, because the relationship between Walt and C.V. Wood quickly soured. But Todd James Pierce offers two plausible reasons why Roy would meet with Wood separately. So first, Roy Disney at this point is taking a more active role with the project. And after Disneyland Inc. is incorporated, so Wood would be working with Roy for Disneyland Incorporated and not with Walt at WED Enterprises. The legal separation between WED Enterprises and Disneyland Inc. meant that the companies functioned autonomously, including in terms of their respective staffing and financing. And that makes a good deal of sense to me. However, the tension between Walt Disney and C.V. Wood was already apparent at this point. And after all, Roy Disney was hiring the general manager of his brother's theme park. Nevertheless, C.V. Wood accepts the job and he takes on the role of vice president of Disneyland Incorporated and the first general manager of Disneyland. So Stevie Wood is, well, as I mentioned, he's a colorful character, but he's really critical for coming up with a strategy of how to bridge the financing gap between the initial seed money that ABC gives to the investment and opening day. He comes up with a plan that instead of looking for big investments, So Walt Disney had this, hope, this optimism that, ABC comes along and then perhaps there'll be another large public company that follows. Wood says, instead of attracting the large investments, look for several smaller investments to share the burden of park construction. So the logic behind Wood's idea is very simple. Disneyland Inc. would offer bids of physical space in the park. Rather than pool a large investment sum into park construction, individual corporate accounts would sign 5 to 10-year leases for their own park attraction, museum exhibit, restaurant space, or retail shop. And these companies would bring important financing to Disneyland. And Disneyland would bring something very important to these sponsors. They would bring a whole market with which companies could debut their new family-friendly consumer products. And so just as ABC would be the sole concessionaire inside the park, these individual corporate leases sign exclusivity deals of various goods and services throughout the park. When Wood debuted this idea, Walt Disney went ahead and pitched to companies that he had past business dealings with. So the companies that he felt comfortable approaching, he approaches Joyce Hall of the Hallmark Company. But unlike Walt Disney, Stevie Wood was willing to confidently cold call companies. For example, the first contract Wood secures for Disneyland Incorporated was a deal with Swifts in 1955. So the Chicago-based meatpacking company agrees to a lease of over $100,000 per year to build and operate a restaurant in the park. And he gains more confidence after Swifts, and he starts adjusting his sales pitch to emphasize that Walt Disney would find unique ways to integrate the identity of sponsors into the park. So according to Robert Foster, who is the lead attorney for Disneyland Incorporated, and he's hired after the park opens, this corporate sponsor lessee program that Wood pioneered came at a time when Walt Disney had exhausted all other financing options. And like the Swifts contract, companies leasing physical space at the park agreed to supply their own products and staff their own establishments. So by 1955, outside investment deals in the form of corporate sponsorships comprised the majority of the park's revenue. And the strategy, Wood's corporate sponsorship strategy, brought in just enough income to finalize construction at Disneyland, at least most of it. So the Disneyland Railroad, which was an ode to the original hobbies that started it all, that Disneyland Railroad was one of several unfinished attractions well after opening day. So an individual named Van Arsdale France, who was hired by Stevie Wood as part of Disneyland's first management team, wrote that, quote, "I remember Walt's love for the train. I also recall, during opening weeks, the person that complained about having to pay to see Walt Disney's construction area." All right. So fast forward, the park is now nearing opening day. Enough is constructed to open the park. And 1 week before Disneyland opens its gates to the public in July of 1955, Walt Disney invites members of the press to come and stroll the grounds and experience the park. And he invites the same Los Angeles Times journalist who told him that he would never make the July opening date. Apparently, a few hours after the sneak peek of the park, the columnist wrote in the Los Angeles Times the following day, "There aren't enough adjectives to describe the wonders of this playground. Disneyland is not only the world's 8th wonder, it is the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th." An opening day ceremony was a star-studded television affair on ABC. ABC film crews captured all the pomp and circumstance for a summer broadcast special, Dateline Disneyland. Walt Disney welcomed guests on camera with a dedication to the park. One Washington Post journalist wrote, who was sent to cover opening day ceremonies, "I would like to be kind and say that the show wasn't too bad, but why tell a lie? It was terrible." July 17th, 1955 was a production nightmare. The columnist, Washington Post columnist covering opening day ceremonies continued. How many times were there camera shots of Ronald Reagan, an Art Linkletter without sound? But the broadcast snafus aside, when the crowds entered the park, the Disneyland was quickly overwhelmed by its visitors. Average wait times were well over an hour long. Several attractions, as I mentioned, remained unfinished. A gas main broke inside Fantasyland, rides had temporary breakdowns, and some of Disneyland's corporate sponsors were forced to close down restaurant operations and troubleshoot construction problems. Opening day accounts, park staff witnessed melting asphalt on Main Street, flooding on the Mark Twain, and a veritable flood of families storming rides inside Fantasyland. But meanwhile, Walt Disney was rushed from one part of the park to another, while ABC film crews covered his dedication of each of the lands, and apparently didn't realize the failure of opening day until he read the press accounts the following day. The same Washington Post writer who described his disappointing visit on opening day wrote, "I kept waiting and waiting for some of Disney's redoubtable magic. Where were the cartoon characters who have rightfully taken their places in our culture?" A representative of Disneyland Incorporated replied to the journalist, "Well, they'll be on ABC starting in October." And alternatively, as Bernard France put it a few years later, "There's always been a conflict between show and business in the show business of Disneyland." So, from the earliest construction days of Disneyland, and nearly a decade after the July 17th ribbon cutting ceremony, the relations between Disneyland Inc. and WED Imagineering grew progressively more tense. The attractions themselves were fraught with operational issues stemming from disputes between management and the corporate sponsors. Disneyland Incorporated's management also obstructed in-park maintenance because the executives were unwilling to authorize the closure of certain sponsored attractions. So Stevie Wood limited the Imagineers' access to the park, preventing them from finishing, fixing, and troubleshooting various attractions. WED was blocked by the park's operating company. And they were blocked on the grounds that Imagineers needed management approval to work inside the park. Though these corporate sponsorship deals were essential for raising the funds to open Disneyland, the contracts and C.V. Wood himself soon impinged on a core design philosophy that Walt Disney had for his theme park. Walt Disney wanted his guests to experience a space of ultimate quality control, but the sponsorship deals and the conflict between management and Imagineering bled into nearly all designs throughout the park. Because Disneyland Incorporated and WED Imagineering were separate companies, the Imagineers could not sidestep the park management. And at the time, Walt Disney was only a 17% shareholder of Disneyland Incorporated. Walt Disney was unable to overrule Stevie Wood and his executive level decisions. Without a majority stake, Walt could not secure any actionable leverage over Disneyland's first sponsors, Disneyland Incorporated, the park management, nor was he able to buy out existing sponsors or in any way regain control of the park. So between 1965, or rather 1956 and 1965, Walt Disney Productions, the public animation and film company, acquired and then purchased the startup company and the operating company that together designed, built, and managed Disneyland. So the slide I have right here is Walt Disney Productions IPO in the New York Stock Exchange in 1957. So as I mentioned, the company goes public in 1940. And just really quickly, the difference between, going public and having an IPO, an initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange, is only the difference between issuing over-the-counter stock, which is issued to stockholders of the company, and common stock. So this is the first issue of common stock, and that is in 1957. So 1957, Walt Disney Productions has their IPO listing on the New York Stock Exchange. And the following year, Walt Disney Productions purchases additional stock in Disneyland Incorporated, and their holding goes from 34% to 68% of the theme park's operating company. Within the same year, the last remaining joint tenants of Disneyland Incorporated agreed to begin selling shares of Disneyland to Walt Disney Productions. And in 1960, Walt Disney Productions is able to secure a buyout of ABC. So ABC sold its 35% stock in Disneyland Incorporated to Walt Disney Productions. And the president of ABC reported the Disney stock was paid in a combination of cash as well as payable notes over 5 years. And a subsidiary of ABC would continue to operate the food concessions inside Disneyland under a new lease agreement at the park. So the buyout restructured Disneyland Incorporated's existing joint ownership, owned by multiple investors, ABC being a large investor. And it transformed the park's operating company into a wholly owned subsidiary of Walt Disney Productions, no longer autonomous. It is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Walt Disney Productions. The same year, ABC agrees to sell its majority stake. Walt Disney Productions reports gross revenue, and as usual, it cites its film production and merchandising, but now it is also listing revenue from amusement park income. And the agreement, which is noted by the president of ABC, to transfer ABC stock in Disneyland Incorporated to Walt Disney Productions, rather, the cash payment is really critical for Walt Disney Productions' next move. So it was part of a strategy to limit the cost of purchasing Walt Disney's theme park, that Disneyland Incorporated would be paying ABC on behalf of Walt Disney Productions. So It was a move to bleed Disneyland Incorporated of its profits by this large lump sum cash payment to ABC before even negotiating the final price to acquire the theme park. The deal bled Disneyland Incorporated well into the red, making Walt Disney Productions' ultimate purchase of the theme park a reportable tax loss. And yes, there was a hit to the revenue of this move because, at this point, Disneyland is a wholly owned subsidiary of Walt Disney Productions. But despite the immediate hit to revenue, at the end of this payment period, which ends in 1965 with ABC, the shares of Walt Disney Productions stock rose. The price of shares were hitting an all-time high at this point. And this report also follows the Walt Disney Productions stock buyback agreement with its shareholders, allowing its shareholders to reap in the benefit of this this rather radical move of bleeding one of its subsidiaries before purchasing it. And this the payment plan and the stock buyback with the shareholders has a lot to do with a company standing on Wall Street at this moment. But beyond Wall Street, the move to buy out ABC and consolidate Disneyland at the cheap, but still consolidate Disneyland, was part of an executive level push to begin integrating seamlessly the promotion of its own animation and films throughout the park. So beyond saving the theme park and restructuring its complicated management and rewriting the terms of its corporate sponsorship deals, it was a way for Walt Disney Productions to, as I mentioned, seamlessly begin the process of integrating its animation and films into the theme park. And similar to consolidating Disneyland Incorporated as it does between 1958 and 1965, Walt Disney Productions consolidates Disneyland Incorporated. In 1960, Walt Disney Productions purchases a majority share of Walt's startup company, WED Imagineering. And the deal follows with a plan to begin integrating Imagineering in-house at the animation and film company and the film studio. So there was the initial purchase of stock in WED, and there was also a plan set to acquire Walt Disney startup by 1965. Now that case is particularly interesting because despite the negotiations happening as far as what amount of stock is being traded and when Walt Disney Productions plans to bring the Imagineers in-house, the Imagineers themselves push back and delays the deal. But ultimately, by 1965, Walt Disney Imagineering, WED Enterprises, Walt Disney startup, is now firmly in-house at the company and begins as well to work on some of the new films that are slated to come out through Walt Disney Productions. But for Disneyland, now that both Disneyland Incorporated and WED Imagineering have been acquired by Walt Disney Productions, the problems of management went away. So Disneyland Inc. under Stevie Wood, when he was obstructing the Imagineers from working inside the park, that issue is resolved. And for Walt, it's important because WED Imagineering reestablishes their creative control over the theme park and their ability to move in and troubleshoot and really have access in a way that when the park opens for those first years, they it was very difficult, and it was the reason why Stevie Wood, who was the first hire for Disneyland Incorporated, is also the first fire. But together with the ABC buyout, the IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, the deal with shareholders, and the acquisition of Disneyland Incorporated and the purchase of Walt Disney's startup company, WED Imagineering. It increased Walt Disney Productions stock value, but it completed the public company's full consolidation of Disneyland. So by 1965, 1 decade after Walt Disney opened his first theme park in Anaheim, California, Walt Disney Productions had secured real ownership, total ownership of the theme park. Concerning its revenue, its management, its capital stock, Walt Disney Productions now owned Walt Disney's theme park. And for Walt Disney Productions, consolidating Disneyland and Disney Imagineering marked the beginning of a new cornerstone of the public company's business, the Disney Parks and Resorts. So back to my question of, my first question was, who built the Disney Parks and Resorts, Walt or Wall Street? Then I'll say, who owns the Disney Parks and Resorts? And as I just underscored, that this period, this 10-year consolidation push, firmly establishes Walt Disney Productions' ownership of Disney Parks and Resorts. However, as far as who built the Disney Parks and Resorts, there is no Disneyland without the public company divesting in Walt Disney. And yes, there is no Disney Parks and Resorts without Walt Disney. But Walt Disney Productions and the shareholders did not build the Disney Parks and Resorts. Walt Disney did in spite of them and in spite of Wall Street. So that is all for me. I have another image of a stock certificate. This is a little bit later. This is when we're getting into Walt Disney World territory, 1975. But yes, that is all for me. And if anyone has any questions or comments, we can get into that now.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, if you have any comments or questions, please raise your hand. Oh, do we have something in the? Oh, Isabel has a comment. Jennifer, do you have access to the chat option?
I do. Yeah, 1 second. Let me. Oh, well, thank you. That's a nice compliment and great question. Yeah, so my access to my sources. Well, I will say that this project, I started this project in 2014. This project has legs beyond Cornell. And the first archive that I went into is in the University of Central Florida. And it is a paper collection of one of the names mentioned, Robert Foster, who is one of the lead attorneys for the park, who later is really influential in the secret land buyout for Walt Disney World. It's his personal papers, as well as one of the individuals that is on the Stanford research team, Harrison Price, Buzz Price. And those collections of papers there was a lawsuit with the Walt Disney Company to bring some of those papers in-house. So there was a lot of restrictions on them. And somewhere in the 2010s, I believe, if not all of them, but a vast majority of them were lifted. And so I was in the process of sort of conceiving of an idea of how to write a thesis as a senior, and I got a grant from Berkeley to go visit that archive and do some research, and that's kind of where this project started. Since then, I mean, that's it was quite a while ago. I have really at Cornell, and like one of the wonderful things about doing my PhD here is that I have access to more sources on the Disney side, as some Disney historians have been really making a concerted effort to pool a lot of our collective resources. And so I've been a beneficiary of that. But a lot of what I have with particularly in the financial side is, I will be perfectly frank, I have to reinvent the wheel constantly. There's between 1956 and 1965, I don't have access to the capital expenditure reports or the corporate meeting minutes. I would love that. I mean, they're in the company archives. But what I've done instead is, the SEC filings are public, and and all of the earnings reports that that go through, whether it's New York Stock Exchange or as I mentioned, the SEC. So I've had to do a lot of reinventing the wheel. Yeah, so which is tedious, but it's very satisfying. I will say that.
I've got a whole list of questions, but I'll ask one now. I'm really fascinated in a big picture kind of way of your seemingly to flip the traditional narrative on its head. So for those of you who don't follow Disney history, the traditional narrative is that Roy, the older brother, is the hard-nosed businessman, numbers cruncher, and Walt is the free-spirited artist. And according to company lore, the two men make the dynamic duo, right? Walt comes up with the ideas and has the visions, and Roy finds the way financially. But it seems like your narrative is a Walt who is equally hard-nosed and equally concerned about the books and the numbers, and is less that kind of whimsical artist. And I think that's tremendous. Was that intentional? Are you trying to bring down that statue, so to speak, of the pure artist Walt?
Yeah. That's a great question. Absolutely. Well, and I would say that it's because, so one thing I find so fascinating about Walt Disney as a historical figure is the trajectory of his various careers. So his career as an animator, and then his career as a theme park owner. When Walt moves to television and really makes inroads in television, he pursues television in a way that is not just groundbreaking in the sense that he's the first head of a Hollywood studio to move to television, but he produces and is the master of ceremonies for the Squaw Valley Olympics. And through his television deal for the Olympic Games, Squaw Valley is the first televised Winter Olympic Games. And that's thanks to Walt Disney's production company. So Walt Disney becomes this public face in a way where it's like he sort of has a new career renaissance, if you will. So he has these kind of, like, you can see his trajectory in animation, and then you can really see his time as a manager of the studio. And then when Imagineering comes online, but then again towards the end of his life, because he passed away in 1966, his public persona and his face and name and likeness is really it dominates his professional identity at the time. I will say though that as far as the kind of like dichotomy of Roy being the the buttoned up one, and then Walt being the free spirit, I do find it to be in some respects kind of the opposite, because Roy Disney and what he manages to do, particularly leading this idea of yes, the divestment, but I would also say of bleeding the park into the red before acquiring it, is so creative. And it is something that I have never come across for another public company before the late 1970s. So that's a trend that, you see that with a lot of, modern companies like tech companies, but he's pulling off some like financial creativity that is mind blowing. I mean, there's no other public company at the time that's managing these somewhat risky, but clean. there's no fraud. I mean, he's doing this kind of like financial artistry in a way that I would say he's very creative.
So this is Roy you're talking about?
Roy, yes.
Well, it sounds like that's your second book project then, Roy the Magician.
Yeah, Roy the Magician, yeah.
Well, that's really fascinating that as creative as Walt is with the parks and animation and films, Roy, you could say, is as creative financial with the numbers. It's a different kind of creativity. That's really good. I got to chew on that for a while. All right, does anyone else have any? I've got more questions, but does anyone else want to chime in? Don't be shy. All right, I'll ask another question. It's a logistical question. So how did Walt, to fill Imagineering, at least the story goes, that Walt took animators and set designers from Walt Disney Production and he plucked them out and put them in WED and said, "You're an Imagineer now." And they're like, "What's an Imagineer?" And he's like, "You figured out, you make it up as you go." How did that happen logistically, right? Because if I understood your presentation, there are two different companies that were in some ways at odds with each other. How was Walt able to did they have to quit Walt Disney Productions and then get rehired by WED? Or was there like an internal transfer system that was created? Or did Walt just get what he wanted because he was Walt?
Yeah, that's great question. Yeah, so it's kind of like all of the above. So one of the, as I mentioned, with the first company, the first startup company, which is WDI before WED, and the initial individuals that he brings on board, they're not affiliated with Walt Disney Productions. However, when WED is incorporated, it is because this being an issue, it is incorporated as a legally autonomous subsidiary of Walt Disney Productions in the category that it has. So Walt Disney Productions cannot have more than a 30% stake, and they have like basically a consistent 17 to 20% investment in WED. But it sort of it clears up this issue of the staffing. So at that point, bringing animators over, this WED now is this R&D subsidiary of Walt Disney Productions. That is, it's relatively seamless, and it also allows them, when Walt Disney Productions makes the push to acquire WED, also it's sort of like reversing the legal restrictions. It's also easy. So it's like, so Disneyland Incorporated was more difficult, but WED, if it hadn't been for the fact that the Imagineers were a little bit concerned about being acquired by by Walt Disney Productions, they are so WED is legally separate, and Walt Disney Productions has a cap on the amount of stake that they can have in the company. But there is enough of there's basically, it allows for sort of a staffing swap over, if you will. And then when the parent company goes to acquire it, they sort of they buy enough stock in it to then change the legal status. So now it's no longer legally separate, and then they buy the rest of the stock in it. Yeah.
Anyone else wanted to jump in? Any other thoughts?
I'll just throw one out there about Stevie Wood.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of interested in his character and how he came into the story. It was very clear to me that when he was hired and brought on, he was doing a lot of financial work to help get things going. But then he seemed to turn into this character that sort of just gummed up the works and didn't let the Imagineers in and so forth. And is there more to his character and his story in the later part of his interaction with Disneyland? Is there positive things he thought he was doing when Walt would be perceiving him to be getting in the way? Is there more to his character and perspective behind all that?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, so Stevie Wood like he's super colorful too. It's just a fascinating character. This is I'm sort of pulling from two separate chapters, but sort of the tail end of one of them is that so Stevie Wood is fired in 1956, but he's expected to stay on, and he sort of just abandons the company, and he starts speaking publicly about Walt and saying things along the lines of like, Walt didn't even build Disneyland, it was just Roy and I. And Walt Disney sues Stevie Wood at a certain point shortly after Stevie Wood's making these public statements, which is one of the reasons why Stevie Wood, even though he is the first vice president of Disneyland Incorporated and the first general manager of the park, why he is his existence in the company archives exists in legal. He doesn't even have files in the corporate archives. He's been pretty much erased from the Disney history. The historian that I mentioned, Todd James Pierce, did a painstaking job of reinventing the wheel and writing Stevie Wood's history, because Stevie Wood goes on to really be an amusement park tycoon. He has his hand in theme parks like Six Flags but also just like really impressive tourism investments. He's also part of the financing team that gets the London Bridge moved, and so he has like this brief connection that he has with the Disney brothers is really critical for Disneyland. But then it sours so shortly after the park opens that as soon as Walt Disney sues him, and I believe the lawsuit goes to court in 1957, he's completely erased from the history. But without him, and I make this argument that there is without him, they don't get enough money to open the park. But also when we think about the Disney parks today, that hallmark feature, no pun intended, Hallmark Company, but of like brought to you by, Brawny, or, the Carnation Cafe, or, brought to you by Chiquita Banana, or, the deals that they have throughout the park with, and, it used to be McDonald's and now it's Starbucks throughout the park. This corporate lessee sponsorship that Disneyland is to this day is still so well known for, amongst other amusement parks, that starts with Stevie Wood. He's super critical, and then it's just sort of this really tense relationship between he and Walt, and then Walt really doesn't like being publicly embarrassed, so sues him. But yeah, that's a great question.
All right, anyone else? We have time for another one, if another comment or question. All right, well, I think it's worth noting that Disney World, like I said, it's 50th anniversary. Magic Kingdom is just in a couple of weeks, on October 1st. And in Disney World, there is a statue of Roy in the park, not in Disneyland though, right? Unless I'm totally mistaken, right? So I think Ms. Begakis has done a great service to Roy. Perhaps there should be a Roy statue in Disneyland. But if you guys ever go to Disney World, next time you see that statue of Roy, he doesn't get to stand triumphantly, he's seated. But perhaps he played a much larger role than we suspected. So your presentation said that by the time Disney World is conceived, it's all been consolidated under the one company, and that's Roy's company by that point, right? I mean, that's, yeah. And Roy is the one who opens Disney World, right? Walt dies, and in 1971, poor Roy, who's very old and wants to play golf, he's the one who is as tasked with actually carrying out the completion and opening of Walt Disney World. So I guess I'm just fascinated by this because it just changes my whole way of thinking about it, because it seems like by that point Roy has been doing this for a while now. it changes the way I kind of understand his role. But anyway, I'll harass Ms. Begakis on my own with my other questions. I appreciate you all tuning in tonight. Thank you very much. If you have more questions or comments for her, feel free to reach out to me or to her directly and pose your questions over email or whatever, or on social media. She has quite a big following. And thank you very much. I hope to see you again at our next Experts Next Door. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.